Welcome to Outside Ourselves. I'm your host, Kelsi. Today, my guest is Christian author Ian Harber. Ian is someone I've followed on social media for a long time. I was so excited to have the opportunity to meet him and interview him in person. Today, we're talking about Ian's new book, Walking Through Deconstruction. I think Ian's story is really unique and one that we need to hear. I'm hoping we will hear more of in the future. Typically, I think when we talk about Christian deconstruction, what you might think of is someone who has deconstructed or left their faith and is no longer a Christian, no longer a part of the church. But Ian actually had that experience, wrestled with his faith for quite some time, and now has come back to a confession that is rooted in historic Christianity. He confesses the death and resurrection of Christ. He's a part of a local church. And so this book not only shares part of that journey with readers, but is also meant to be a guide for those who know someone who's deconstructing and want to be a help and want to just be there for those people who are going through that process of, as Ian describes it, really a crisis of faith. I think Ian talks about deconstruction in a lot of helpful ways and in some ways that you maybe haven't heard before. I think a lot of times throughout this conversation, we come back to the fact that Christ is the foundation of the Christian faith, and our hope that as people wrestle with Christianity, leave behind some of the cultural things of Christianity that really don't belong, as people doubt and suffer and are at times unsure of what the Christian faith is, that's really where they come back to. They come back to the person and work of Christ, to Christ's life, death, and resurrection for us, and that is what we place our hope in, our faith in, and that we, no matter where we find ourselves in life, that we can trust that God's promises are certain for us, even when we are not certain ourselves. Thanks as always for listening. I hope you enjoy today's conversation. Ian, thank you so much for coming to Outside Ourselves today. This is my first show for 2025.
Happy New Year.
Yeah.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
And it's so exciting. I love getting to do in-person interviews. So excited that you are close to Dallas, still like an hour away, but thank you for making the drive down here. And I'm super excited to talk about your book, Walking Through Deconstruction. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do to begin.
Yeah, so I live here in the DFW area. I'm married to my high school sweetheart and have two boys, almost a year old and 4.5 year old. And so my story is, I hate doing this because, it's like, tell me about your story. It's like, well, when I was born, but in some ways, I have to do that in order for any of this stuff to make sense. I was raised in a broken family. I was taken from my dad left when I was 1. I was taken from my mom when I was 3, and I was given to my grandparents. And that's actually how I ended up in, just north of Dallas. And so I've lived with them for my whole life growing up. And they gave me a really good childhood. There's a lot of really good things about that. And they were amazing people. And they raised me in the church and Christian home and Christian schools and all that different stuff. And so that was a huge just aspect of my life. But those first 3 years were so tumultuous. And I know I'm so young at that moment, but it frames all of my life is that. And I have memories from that time and documentation from that time. And, I know what happened. And so that has always framed my life. I've always been very aware of that. And so that has been a huge part of things. And so, growing up, I was always dealing with those types of questions, like from a very, very young age. I mean, I remember being in 3rd grade telling myself, I don't know what I'm supposed to do, but whatever my parents said, I'm just going to do the opposite of that. Like, I don't want that kind of life for myself. And so, that took me, all the way through, into high school. And that's when some of these really kind of harder questions started to happen for me, because my grandmother who raised me, when I came to live with them, was diagnosed with chronic lymphocytic leukemia. So a very long lasting kind of cancer. And so the day after Christmas in 2007 is when she passed away from that. And that was the first of 12 funerals that I went to over the course of 2.5 years.
Oh my gosh.
And the last one was my mom taking her own life. And so it's sort of bookended by my functional mother who raised me and my actual mother who abandoned me, both losing their lives, one to cancer, one to suicide, within a 2.5 period.
Teenager.
And I'm a teenager. Yeah. And again, this is all framed in this other context of I've already been dealing with this my whole life. And then, I have these succession of deaths that are all very, very formative for me. So it's sort of in this mix where I start asking a whole bunch of questions, trying to, just figure out what is going on? What is the purpose of this? Just very formative, lots of suffering in that time. And so I was already dealing with that. And then kind of in this, media environment, this is nothing like it is today. You know what I mean? But I stumbled across one of the original deconversion stories on YouTube. Like they're a dime a dozen now. You can just hop on TikTok and the third video you're going to get is somebody deconstructing, but that was not the case back then.
Right.
And this guy just, former Christian, kind of seemed sincerely, genuinely, thoughtfully, laid out the way that he walked away from his faith. And for me, that was like, I have no answer for this. This is brand new information for me. And I just don't feel like in any good, I can't in any sort of integrity believe these things anymore. And so there's probably about a year where I have no idea what I believed. I mean, it was all over the place. And then at the end of that year, I did have a really just weird experience with God that I don't know how to explain. I don't even have good theology for it, but it's just what happened. So I was in my room, and it was kind of over the course of like a couple of weeks. I still had a Bible in my room, and I just realized I had never actually like read much of it, which would probably be a good thing to do. I hadn't read it in a long time. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to read through Matthew and just see like what this is all about. And so I read through Matthew, and I get to the end of Matthew, and I have this thought of, I don't know if Jesus is God. In fact, I have a lot of reasons to think that he might not be. But if there is a God, I hope he's a lot like Jesus. And so I remember praying for the first time in a very long time and just saying, God, I have no idea what's going on here. And I'm pretty young at this time too. I'm just like, I have no idea what's going on here, but I know that this is either real or it's not. And there's no in between. There's no faking it. There's none of this cultural Christianity crap. Like, this is either real or it's not. And I want to take this wherever it leads me, to you or away from you. I don't care. So I'm going to go all in, and whatever you want to do with that, you do with that. And I don't have good theology for this. I'm not particularly, Pentecostal or whatever, but I just remember hearing God say, I can work with that. And there was like a moment where I was like, okay, I'm in. That doesn't mean I'm like, Christian even. It just means I'm in on this pursuit, And so, that took me to some very weird places. That was when I started going down far more kind of progressive Christian rabbit trails. And still, it's been years having no idea what I believed. And still having all kinds of doubts, all kinds of questions, not thinking the Bible is authoritative. You'll kind of hear the line, like, it's not words from God, it's words about God, and kind of believing that for a long time. Not affirming an actual resurrection, not affirming any of these things that actually matter. And that's the main stuff. Forget, everything downstream from that.
Right.
And so, that was where I lived for just ever. I went to college, got a degree in, communications and marketing. And, there was kind of a confusing time in there that we were even talking about a little bit before this podcast about just how I was doing ministry while I was deconstructing, and, I think what a lot of people don't realize is that deconstruction is a lot like the grieving process of losing a parent. And so, in the grieving process, there's these 5 stages. There's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. There's this weird bargaining phase that, like, it's almost hard to define, but it's like you're trying to make this deal with God of like, if I just do these things, you're trying to promise, if I just do these things, everything's going to work out, right? It's like you're short circuiting the grieving process and trying to find an early off ramp instead of actually moving through the process and letting it affect you. And I think deconstruction works in a lot of really similar ways. And so for me, this process where I'm like, I'm deconstructing, I have no idea what I believe or what I'm doing or anything like that, but I'm in this like young adult ministry doing all these things. It was like this bargaining phase for me of like, if I just kind of do these things, all the doubts and all the questions are going to go away, and we'll all forget about this, right? Without actually doing the work and of trying to figure it out.
So you're trying to get in that stage back to belief, you would say.
Yeah, I'm searching for the truth.
Yeah.
Whatever that is.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Not trying to, I think you talk a little bit or a lot about this in your book about how from the outside people, I think, assume deconstruction is people just trying to jump off as quick as they can, like, which probably is the case for some people.
Sure.
But it's really helpful to understand that that's a lot of people are trying to stay as much as they can. They want to stay. They don't want to leave, even within this process of deconstruction.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what a lot of people don't understand about deconstruction. I'm probably getting ahead of myself in some of this.
No,
but
we'll jump around. That's great.
You know, a lot of people see deconstruction, they think, oh, this is just somebody wanting to leave the faith, like what you were talking about. And I certainly, I mean, it's impossible to deny that there are people who say, oh, I'm deconstructing, and then just like immediately bail. You know what I mean? But I think the Bible has categories for that. It's called apostasy. You know what I mean? It's just leaving the faith, and people do it all the time. And, you know, it's just part of life. Deconstruction is sort of this, Mark Sayers has this phrase he calls the gray zone. And he's not talking about this in particular, but it's this liminal space between one state and another. And people sort of live in this gray zone. He talks about our culture being in a gray zone right now. But I think deconstruction is that in a lot of ways. It's not that, oh, I'm looking for any excuse to leave the faith and this is just a really convenient excuse for me to get out. It's actually more like, I'd say that deconstruction is a crisis of faith. It's this crisis that happens to you after, an event or a series of events where all of these things that you once took for granted as self-evidently true are no longer self-evidently true. And if what it feels like, you'll hear this language, go read any deconstruction story, you'll hear this language. It's like a trap door opens up from under you and you just fall through. And you're in this dark room and you have no idea where you are and all the lights just turned out and you're just trying to find a light switch. And people will say, well, you should deconstruct the good way, not the bad way, and it's like, I don't know what way I'm going. I'm just feeling the walls, trying to find the light switch, turn the light back on, and technique isn't exactly like the most helpful thing right now. Maybe somewhere down the line, sure, but at this moment, no. And so just trying to figure out what that's like. It's a crisis. It's very, very scary. And so deconstruction, more often than not, again, it's really hard to say without any sort of caveats or anything like that, but more often than not, the process of deconstruction is not a process of leaving the faith. It's a process of hanging on to every last thread of faith that you can find for as long as you possibly can. And for some people, that's all they can do. And eventually they get to a spot where they feel like they have to let go for one reason or another. Obviously, I don't agree with them. And I think there's lots of factors why that's the case. But I also understand what that feeling is like. And I think it is legitimate. And when people try to invalidate that by saying, oh, they just didn't do this, it's like, this is not just an intellectual exercise that people do for fun. This is an existential experience that happens to them that's very scary. And so I think for other people, and this is what happened to me eventually, was they are able to hold on to one thread and then two threads and then three threads. And then they realize that a new sweater that once unraveled is being woven again, that they can actually wear. And, God's part in that and our part in that, it's almost impossible to separate those things. It's God working in us to will and to work, and God gives us faith and we live into our faith, but I think that's God rebuilding our faith and reconstructing our faith into something that isn't as bound to these cultural expressions. You know what I mean? It's something much more fundamental to what Christians have always believed. It's not that every little pond of Christianity is bad, but kind of realizing I can live in this pond, but my faith is not in this one expression. It's in the stream of Christianity, the ocean of God's grace, and how
the universal church.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. It is so interesting that we always are so quick to rush to like 10 steps to whatever. I think not only as you're talking about it within deconstruction, like people outside think, oh, just do these 10 things or whatever, these 5 things. Do it in this way with this technique and you'll get back on track. But that's also, I think, a problem within Christianity itself when we think like faith is an exercise in following 10 steps, following
Right.
a manual, following the law in the sense that the law will save you. And so it is interesting that I think that I'd be curious your thoughts. I think that's kind of one thing that's pushing people out is they can't do it. They realize they can't do it anymore. It's not, the instructions are not getting them to where they've been promised to be. And then it's funny that we kind of double down on that in deconstruction, or for people that deconstruct and say, well, just try this. Of course, that's not going to be a helpful technique or way to minister or love those that are going through this process.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think about the wisdom literature a lot, and it's funny in this stage of my life, I'm actually really into Proverbs. I think having kids has something to do with that. But, Ecclesiastes has always been so meaningful to me for a lot of reasons. And I think it's even shifted why over the years. But you have these two, and really, if you include Job, these three books bound together, right? And so you have Proverbs, which actually just on a cursory reading does seem a lot like the law in some ways, the instruction manual, just do these things and you'll have a blessed life. And, one, just realizing how to interpret Proverbs, which is these are principles, not promises, even that is a baseline helpful understanding of how that book actually works. But the fact that it's coupled with these other two books, Ecclesiastes and Job, Ecclesiastes talking about how you can pursue every good thing in life, and yet at the end of the day, you're going to die. And that is something that I had to understand very quickly in my life, is that no matter what you do, no matter how good or bad you are, depending on the person that I'm looking at in this casket, you are going to die. And Ecclesiastes is right about that. The wicked and the righteous both go where the animals go, into the dirt, And then Job, which is this extremely righteous man who endures all this suffering for no reason. And there's no real explanation given for why. He just does, and so you have to hold these things in tension. And I think if evangelicalism, which this is going to be a very broad statement to say, and I understand that, but if I were to just paint with the broadest brushstroke I possibly can, I think if evangelicalism has a failure, it is probably simply not comprehending and communicating the complexities of life. It's just oversimplifying everything. It's a Proverbs only faith.
Yeah.
And again, Proverbs is good. I'm really into Proverbs in this season of my life, but it's not the only perspective that the Bible even gives us, because life is very complex.
Yeah.
And so that's the only thing that you give people, you kind of create this expectation that life and faith, because these things are interwoven, are supposed to be this up and to the right faith. Things should be getting better for me year over year.
Right.
And I should be getting a return on my investment. This is very like stock market,
Yeah. Very Western and American,
absolutely.
really. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so you don't have any sort of framework for suffering. You don't have any sort of category for that, of how suffering is actually redemptive, of how suffering works into God's plan for our lives, of how, as Paul says in Romans 5, we glory in our sufferings. We glory in our sufferings. I've never heard a sermon say we glory in our sufferings before. And that what you go through, all of the worst parts of your life, is not a blot on your life. It is your glory that God is using to transform you for the healing of the world. I've never heard a sermon on that before. And I've heard a lot of really good sermons. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so trying to help people understand that all of these things are for God's glory and for our glory and for our good, and working them into a coherent and complex vision for life, including our life of faith, which, I mean, again, you can't separate those things. And I think even separating those things has led to a lot of issues, because what people have seen growing up in the church is people compartmentalize their faith. And so, they'll go to church and they'll do these things, and they'll say all the right things, and they'll, even read their Bibles and stuff like that. But then the way they actually live their lives are completely separate. And so a lot of times you'll hear people who are deconstructing say this, and I agree with them, that they were the people that actually believed the things being taught. And they looked around and they said, oh, the people teaching me these things don't actually believe them.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so if they don't actually believe them, and I'm the one going all in, maybe I'm the crazy one and I need to ditch it. You know what I mean? And I don't care about this sort of like, I don't know the right word, just like accoutrements of cultural Christianity. If it's not real, why even bother with these types of things, you know? And so being able to just be, and this is why I wrote the book, not to people who are deconstructing. I think they get enough of that sort of messaging and even shame. And, you know, some of those things are helpful. Some of those books are helpful. But I wanted to write to the church, say, we need to be Christians who actually believe these things. We need to be churches that are healthy and actually believe these things, and are places that can foster a life of faith rather than gridlock someone's imagination into this very rigid, very, you know, if you don't agree with us on every single one of these tertiary issues, then you're probably not a Christian. It's like, that is not how any of this has ever functioned in the history of the church, you know? And so, just trying to make sure we as Christians are healthy, because I think it's our example, it's our life of faith that is a witness to the reality of Christ, the truthfulness of the gospel. And if we can't live those kinds of lives, then why would we expect someone to not deconstruct? You know, why would we expect someone to not leave the faith if it's not real to us in every part of our lives?
Talking about kind of a Proverbs like faith only that's separated from Christ himself is obviously such an issue. And you see all of these, you see how separation starts to happen for people when their foundation is not, and the object of their faith is not Christ himself, and it's not the object of faith that's confessed by churches at large. And you wrote, I think you had a little bit about a little paragraph or two, or maybe a couple pages on 1 Corinthians 3 about laying our foundation as Christ first. Can you talk a little bit about maybe coming back to that in your own story? And you've already mentioned today too, kind of the fact that really the cornerstone of faith is Christ crucified and resurrected. And I think that what's interesting is, you know, some people listening will be like, well, yeah, obviously. But for a lot of Christians, I think, especially in America, I grew up just American evangelical as well. You know that that's important. And you might even confess and know that that's the center matter of faith itself. But until I think there's suffering or something, you know, hard in life, at least for me personally, maybe I'm just speaking personally, that didn't hit home for a really long time. And I don't know, I think that could be just age and maturity that just happens, you know, as you get older. But I think it is also an issue with churches in America that is not the foundation, and that is not really the confession at large that is in holding, you know, all these other things, whether it's the way we view the law in light of the gospel, the way we try to compartmentalize and kind of avoid doing certain things because we realize we can't do everything right or whatever. Can you talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah. So for me, I mean, Reconstruction for me really began when it's a confluence of factors. And again, that's sort of my point in trying to make, I try to communicate simply, but also simply that it is a complex issue. You know what I mean? It's not for just one thing. And so there was a couple of things that happened at once. So in 2016, I got married, and there was this thing that happened. Donald Trump became president. I'm not trying to be political, but it's important because for me, you know, looking around, that was the beginning of a lot of people's deconstruction, but I had been deconstructing for years before that. And so what I experienced at that moment was I looked around and I saw a lot of people who on the more progressive wing of things, and again, saying lots of things that I shared lots of the concerns at the time, you know, hearing that and realizing that they were treating anybody who voted for Trump or had any sort of conservative political persuasion at all the exact same ways that the conservatives that I grew up around were treating progressive people. And I said, wait a second. Okay, so I actually left this area to find more compassion and inclusivity and love and whatever. And it turns out it doesn't exist there either. You have to poke the right hornet's nest, you know? And so that was sort of another moment of disillusionment for me, just in the opposite direction. you fast forward a year, my grandfather who raised me passed away in a fluke plane crash. I didn't even mention a mentor that molested 5 of my friends when I was in high school. So that kicked off the darkest part of my life, is that plane crash. And lasted for a very long time. And I had just signed up and been accepted into a training program that was the first time I'd ever formally gone and learned theology. It was basically like if you took seminary and shrank it down into a local church. And in fact, I got seminary credit for it and transferred in and went to seminary. So doing that, I had just gotten accepted, and then my grandfather passed away in the crash. And so I never got to tell him that I went into it. And so I go in to this first class. I almost didn't go because of all this, but I decided to stick with it. And on the first day, I had a teacher who lives here in Dallas, is a pastor. He gets up and he says, we do theology in the light so that we can stand on it in the dark. And I kind of had two thoughts. I was like, well, that would have been really nice like 6 months ago, before all this happened in my life. But okay, let's see what happens. Let's do this thing and just see what goes on. And it was the complete opposite experience of everything I grew up with, right? And not even theologically in some ways. I mean, in some ways, like the secondary, tertiary issues, there was some agreement and some disagreement.
Yeah.
But that wasn't the point, right? One, I was seated at a circle table like this with guys, and I just came in raw. I just was like, here's all my questions, here's all my doubts, here's all the weird, like off the wall things I'm thinking, was met with total acceptance, embrace, just like welcome with all of your questions, no judgment. And then the teaching too, it was not focused on these other things that made us different from every other Christian.
Yeah.
It was focused on the things that made us like every other Christian. It was on these core doctrines, just going through the story of Scripture, talking about the different doctrines of Christianity, these core doctrines. Like, why does it matter that Jesus is fully God, fully man?
Yeah.
Why does it matter that the Trinity, learning all that for the first time, Jesus has this line in Matthew about the teacher of the law is like, who is a disciple is like one who goes into the storehouse and brings out treasures new and old. And that's exactly what it was like. It was like someone going into the storehouse and bringing out these old treasures that nobody had ever showed me before. Yeah. And I was like, oh, this is what's been in here the whole time.
Right.
I felt cheated that no one had ever given me those things before. And so I think for me, it was learning that, again, Paul has a line in Colossians that says, in Christ are hidden all the treasures and wisdom of knowledge. And so in this one singular person, Christ, you have an infinite amount of knowledge, an infinite amount of wisdom, an infinite amount of insight into life and all of reality that you can just forever double click on and more pops out of Christ. He's the logos. There's a logic to everything that God does. And nobody had ever taught me that before. Even the moral laws and rules that are part of Christianity, right? Things like sexuality and different things like that when you're first introduced to them, they just feel like a law. There's a logic to them that God bakes in. That is why they are. And sometimes they're not even a pragmatic logic that I think reveals a lot about our assumptions in the time that we live. But there's symbolic logic too to these types of things, and so that reveals something about who God is in the very way it's designed. And those things matter just as much. And so realizing those kinds of things, of that these doctrines are not simply boxes on a Scantron test to be submitted through the machine so that when I die, it's like, see, I made a B+, can you let me in? These are, the Word of God is living and active, right? It pierces all the way to the core of us, and it reveals things about us, and it changes us, and it transforms us, and it's therapeutic for us. Like these truths, living in line with truth, living in line with reality, is actually therapeutic in our sufferings, because it's those truths they're not abstract, they're real, and they transform you, and it's living into those that makes suffering your glory, because you're following the way of Christ. You're going through suffering and into glory, and you are taking up your cross and following him, through that. Yeah. And so realizing how all of these things come together and work together and reveal a portrait of reality, a portrait of truth, and really the genius of God and Jesus and what they've done, what God has done, is I left and I didn't have all my answers questioned, and I didn't even agree with some of the finer points of things that were taught. But I left thinking, okay, this is a foundation that I can build on. This is something I can believe. There's something I can trust in. And I left having, I like to say I had a settled confidence. That's not, I have all my answers, all my questions answered, but I have a settled confidence of, I can actually trust this God. I can actually believe him. And I don't have everything that I need, but I can build on this. Like I can take these truths and take these categories and take what God has revealed and start building and growing from there.
Yeah. I think what stood out to me as you were talking is just this idea that we're constantly trying to, we tend to, as Christians, whether we're on the conservative side as Christians or progressive, try to kind of segment off, one up each other, distinguish ourselves from each other in, I think, a pursuit of righteousness, really, if we're like digging down deep, that like we're trying to prove we're the real Christians, or I'm individually like a Christian because I know I'm better than you or whatever. But it sounds like what kept you in the faith or brought you back was this truth that the gospel unifies. And that doesn't mean that there aren't things in the Bible, there aren't things that are a part of the way that God has set out for us to live that will divide. And even, we talk a lot at 1517 about the gospel being a stumbling block to many. Like the fact that Christ died for you and your sins is a thing we're repulsed by. That is something we, because of our sinful nature, don't want. But there is a deep truth to the fact that Christ is calling all of us to himself in a unifying way that kind of not only makes us his creatures, but makes us puts us on the same playing field as everyone else, that I think is really attractive, and maybe even more so in our day and age when conversations about inclusivity and all of that stuff are very important and a part of our time.
I came to love the doctrine of sin.
Yeah.
I know that seems maybe weird to say. Chesterton said that the doctrine of sin is as plain as potatoes, or it's as practical as potatoes. And I think he's right about that, because in a lot of deconstruction or progressive Christian circles, one of the first, not the first thing usually, but one of the first things to go is this doctrine of sin. Like, we're not actually inherently sinful. Yeah. And I understand why, because there in a lot of evangelical places, and especially like I was raised in this, so I get it. There is a doctrine of sin that's over torqued, you know,
and it leads to shame and guilt that you can't, because then you have to get out of it yourself.
Exactly. You end up back in this kind of works-based righteousness, and it truly, I mean, people say this, and I think I understand what they're saying, that it's like a faith that starts in Genesis 3, but skips over 1 and 2, that you are sinful, but the very first thing is said about us is that we're good and we're made in God's image. And, talking about how in reality, evil is a deprivation of good. Evil doesn't actually exist on its own. It exists as, where there's a vacuum of good, that's where evil is, And so that's sort of the way sin works too. We're created good, and then we sort of give it up in order for our own desires. And that's how we become sinful. Right. And so this doctrine of sin gets thrown out there, but you end up in a really bad spot there too, of now you actually do create this sort of hierarchy of people who are better and worse than each other. Yeah. And this happens by over torquing a doctrine of sin, and people feeling the need to earn their righteousness, like in a more conservative environment. But when you get rid of it completely in a progressive environment, you end up with the exact same scenario, right? And so the doctrine of sin, what it really does, and it's so interesting to me that people want to talk about equality and inclusivity and different things like that, and then throw out the doctrine of sin, because it's that doctrine, it is sin that makes us all equal. Yeah. That actually none of us are righteous, and none of us are able to figure this out on our own. None of us are able to save ourselves. None of us are able to be good enough to be righteous in God's eyes. We all need a savior.
Yeah.
And I know this is foundational, basic gospel stuff, but it gets thrown out in both of these environments. And so when you actually understand that that is what grace is, that grace is God's gift to you in all of our sinfulness, and he has grace for everybody. It is the most inclusive thing you can possibly imagine, because it is for everybody. And we all deal with the sin in us, you know? And so, yes, there's sanctification on the other side of salvation and all these different things, but we are all still marred by sin. We are still all fighting and overcoming our sin. And we are all still sinners in need of a savior. And we're all reliant on him. And so that's why I just don't think you can get rid of that doctrine. And it is, like Chesterton said, practical as potatoes, because you start realizing that a lot of these things that you see in the world that are bad are actually bad. You can make an objective value statement that they are actually bad. Right. What is missed is those bad things that are out there in the world are actually in me too. And the same way that I want to get those bad things out of the world from, you know, a desire for justice or whatever, somehow those bad things also have to get out of me. Yeah. And I'm not going to be able to get those out of myself, out of me myself. Yeah. And so somebody else has to come in from the outside and do that. Yeah. And that's the gospel. That is what Jesus did, you know? And so I think when sin gets out of me, we call that righteousness. And when sin gets out of the world, we call that justice. And I think the conservative people are going to focus more on righteousness and wanting to get that out of me. I think progressive people are going to focus more on justice and want to focus on, you know, getting it out of the world. But when, you know, scripture talks about, I'm blanking on the psalm, but talks about how it's at God's throne that righteousness and justice kiss. They come together, and you can't separate those apart. His throne is built out of righteousness and justice. And so we have to be able to hold those two things together, because we're never going to get sin out of the world if we don't get it out of ourselves first. But we can't do that. We have to have somebody else come do that for us. Yeah. And so I think that's why what you were talking about of that level playing field is huge. And so even in someone deconstructing or reconstructing their faith, it sounds like a weird place to start. Maybe it's not the right place to start. But I think even considering why have Christians always believed in sin? Why has that always been a part of it? What are the alternatives? Like, really, what is the alternative? They're not better than what Christians have always believed about sin. Yeah.
And I think there's been, I don't know if you know, I've heard of Mockingbird Ministries and David Zoll and Simeon Zoll, but Simeon Zoll wrote something a few years ago about, he teaches at Cambridge about trying to talk about sin with his undergrad students, because that language is so lost in our day and age. And I think an interesting connection point to kind of start the conversation, this is from him, is, you know, talking about the things that we are incapable of doing. Like, this is Luther's language too, like we're bound to, you know, you talk about just like social media and your cell phone. Like if you tell someone, have you been able to stop looking at your phone? Like that is an entry point into the doctrine of sin. So I think that's interesting, because there's ways, especially through technology in the last 10 years, that are kind of popping up to talk to people about this in new and somewhat non-threatening ways that they can relate to. But that is, I think, a big issue, is we just have lost the language for sin. As you've, you know, written the book, and for yourself or for others that you know that have been through deconstruction, you know, you kind of already talked about like the core doctrines being important for you. What are some other touch points that you've seen for people that you think are helpful to bring people back into the Christian faith?
Leslie Newbigin has this line about how, I'm going to butcher the actual line, but the concept is that you can't doubt anything except on the basis of other things that you're not doubting. So any questions that you have, you're asking those questions on top of questions that you're not asking. And so you can always go another layer down. Yeah. Okay. And so I think and we've touched on this a little bit, but like what's happening in a lot of deconstruction is that people are asking questions about their faith that are good, legitimate, necessary questions. But in light of assumptions, cultural assumptions that are not being questioned.
Yeah.
And so, questions about individualism, pragmatism, progressivism, and I don't mean that in a political sense. I mean that more in the sense of the belief that the world is progressing to be better and better, and all we have to do is get on board with that inevitable progress of history, questioning that assumption, and so I think, and again, I think, depending on your political persuasion, I think what a lot of progressives, what is making it difficult for them right now is, especially from their perspective, the past 10 years have proven for them that hasn't actually been the case.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's sort of throwing this whole notion of progress up into the air of, I thought things were just going to naturally get better and better and better. And so then when they don't, when a pandemic happens out of nowhere, it's, even though a pandemic roughly every 100 years is actually sort of normal, it's not actually unprecedented. But we believe this story of progress, that these things aren't supposed to happen anymore, but then they do. Now what? Which also makes your theology of suffering really bad, your view of suffering bad if you don't have something like that. And suffering is an intrusion into life, not a redemptive aspect of life. But so I think one of the things that was really helpful for me was actually understanding that we live our life based on these stories that we believe. That we're not inherently making these rational choices about every single thing that we do, but we're filtering our lives through these stories that we're not questioning. We're not questioning progressivism, like proper, we're not questioning individualism. We're not questioning consumerism or pragmatism or these different stories that we just take as our default operating system because of the culture that we live in. And the Bible is operating on completely different assumptions, on completely different stories. And the Bible is telling a story of creation, fall, redemption, consummation. And again, it's simple to say that. And maybe people have even heard that before and it hasn't done anything for them. But if all the riches of wisdom and knowledge are hidden in Christ, and these things, you can never hit the bottom of them. And it's actually in that contemplation of them, in the meditation of that story. Psalm 1, the man who meditates on the law of the Lord day and night is like a tree by streams of water, bearing fruit in and out of season. It's that contemplating and meditation of these truths of Scripture, of God's law, of God's the way that he's designed. And by law, I really just mean like the way he's designed everything, that you start to see that the stories that we are told as a culture are not the stories of reality. Not oftentimes they're not. Yeah. And so it's getting down under those layers. It's like, yes, you're asking questions about the Bible's authority. Yes, you're asking questions about who Jesus is. Yes, you're asking questions about sexuality and all these different things, sin, hell, whatever. But what's not being questioned is these cultural stories. Those are being taken as for granted. Those are being taken as default.
So is it almost like you think people are deconstructing the wrong thing, or would you word that in a different way?
I often say that people don't need to stop deconstructing. They need to deconstruct more.
Oh, interesting.
Because I think people stop at the surface level issues of questions about the faith. Yeah. But there's never this flipping of, why have Christians believed this forever? And do those have anything to say about my default assumptions, cultural assumptions that I'm taking for granted? Yeah. And what makes it hard, and I have a lot of empathy for this, because what makes it hard is those default cultural assumptions get into the church. Yeah. Then intermingle and they become syncretized. And so where does one end and the other begin? That becomes really, really difficult to understand when your church is built around individualism and consumerism and pragmatism and, progressivism, And so it's like, well, my church is highly pragmatic and the world is highly pragmatic. So I guess everything is pragmatic, right? That's the lens we should be thinking through. It's like, no, it's not. There is look through the world symbolically too. Look through, that has no pragmatic value.
Can you talk a little bit, because you've said that word a couple times, for people who might not understand what that means. What do you mean by that? Looking at things symbolically rather than, I guess you're saying it in comparison to pragmatically, right?
Right. So, and again, these things I'm not trying to create a hard line between these things. Again, I think we're talking about a gradient here, not something that's like, it's symbolic, so it's not pragmatic, or it's pragmatic, so it's not symbolic. But I think understanding that you can look through these things at different lenses. So I think sexuality is one of the easiest things to actually think about this through, of the design and man and woman and marriage and sex and these types of things, some people will look at that and say, well, what's the deal? Like, love is love. It doesn't really matter who it's between. That's taking a very pragmatic view of what sex and marriage and all, and what a man and a woman is and all those different things. What they're not understanding is that the way that this is set up is not purely pragmatic. It's also set up symbolically. So this is what Paul is getting at when he is describing marriage in Ephesians 5. He is talking pragmatically about how a family should be structured and different things like that. And then he gets to the end, he says, this is a profound mystery. I'm actually not talking, he's like, while I'm talking about marriage, I'm actually not talking about marriage. I'm talking about Christ and the church. What everything, all the pragmatic things that we just talked about do not terminate on themselves. You're supposed to not just look at the marriage, you're supposed to look through the marriage and see a picture, a symbol of Christ and the church. And so what you're doing is not merely, marriage is not just merely this fleshly contract, right? It's a spiritual symbol, and that actually means something on a spiritual level, which is why these different things like sex between a man and a woman, sex outside of marriage, divorce, these things hold spiritual weight because of the symbols that they carry. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so,
ironically, that's, sorry to interrupt, but that's also, I think, important for conservatives who are saying like,
yes,
marriage is for procreation and you got to have 6 kids or you're, not doing what you're supposed to be doing. So that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, and again, yes, because the symbol carries pragmatic value. Yeah. Right. It determines how you order your actual life. Right. And I think these are things that conservatives don't teach. I mean, I'm painting with really broad brushstrokes here, but all these things are taught on a very pragmatic level. The only explanation I ever got for why homosexuality is wrong is the Bible says so, and also gross. Yeah,
which is not
great. The part of that's, it's like, sure, it's like, yes, that is what the Bible says. Why does the Bible say that? If Christ is the logos, the logic of the universe, the word of the universe, if this is built with order instead of chaos, then there's a reason for these things. And part of it is pragmatic, but part of it is also meant to reveal something about who God is in nature, in reality.
I feel like we've jumped around a little bit, which is great, but I do want to zoom out a little bit just towards the book and kind of your goals for the book, and tell people a little bit about how you structured everything. You talked a little bit about who you wrote this book for. Can you talk about kind of what you hope people gain from reading it? And then also, I know it is divided into the first section is on deconstruction and the second's on reconstruction. Can you tell us a little bit about that organization and why you wrote it that way?
Yeah. So there's been a lot of books on deconstruction that have come out over the past few years, and some of them are better than others.
Yeah.
But what most of them are, you could almost draw like a 2x2, and so what some of them are these books written by pastors and writers and, professors to people who are deconstructing, encouraging them in one way or another, and there's a few really good books in that category. And so there are some ways where I felt like I just didn't have too much to say there. It's not that I couldn't contribute anything unique, but I just think people are saying that, and depending on the person, it just depends. Like, I'm struggling for my words here, because I think those books are good. But again, when someone is in deconstruction, I think technique is not always the most helpful thing to have. It just depends on where someone's at in the process. Then there's this kind of other group of books written by people who have deconstructed, ex-evangelicals, and they're telling their stories or sharing their perspective. And, I think there's some value to that. I think it is good to expose what is bad about evangelicalism in a church. I think we have to be honest about the places where we've got it wrong. Right. So I'm not even all down and out on those kinds of books, but I see very little constructive work happening there. It is very much just, here's what's bad, and why you should also agree with me that it's bad. And I see some of it and I go, yeah, that seems pretty bad. What are we going to do about this? And if the answer is just leave, or leave entirely, or just leave what Christians have always believed behind, I don't think that's the right answer. So I disagree with the conclusion, even if I would agree with some of the things on how we got there. So then there's, kind of this other subcategory of books that are talking about deconstruction to the church, but they're very negative on deconstruction. Actually, I would say I've read multiple books. There's one that's very negative that I have in mind that says deconstruction bad, warning, warning, don't get anywhere near it, be careful, it's dangerous. The other one is like, deconstruction's great, everybody should deconstruct. Deconstruction is a prophetic witness to the church. And I'm like, man, are there good things about it, bad things about it? Yes, I see where you're both coming from, but this is not helpful. And so it's very cynical is the way I would say it, in one direction or another. And so what I wanted to do was write a book that's to the church that is ultimately, it can be brutally honest at times, because I think we have to look at those things, but it ultimately is actually very hopeful. And it is not scared of deconstruction. It is not valorizing deconstruction either, saying this is the best thing in the world, but it's also not saying careful, watch out, just trying to be honest about all of it. Here is why people are deconstructing, here's why I deconstructed, what that dynamic is like. But also, this doesn't have to be the end. It is possible to walk through deconstruction in a way and long enough to where it actually leads to the renewal of your faith. I wanted to take people through the journey of deconstruction the best that I possibly could. This is what it feels like. And you kind of get to the end of part one feeling like, man, I guess that was helpful, but I really feel kind of terrible about this, you know? And then starting in part two, kind of lead people through this journey of reconstruction of here's what it could look like, but it's aimed to the church. And I think that's important because our environment and our relationships have so much to do with our faith. It's love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. We are inherently social creatures, and you can't separate those two things. And so the environments that we're in matter a lot for how our faith grows. That constitutes in a lot of ways the soil of our faith. And so talking to the people of the church, the first chapter in part two is just about relationships, because there's a lot of broken relationships when you talk about deconstruction. Parents and kids that can't talk to each other anymore, friendships that have broken off, and all hard stuff. And then it goes into a chapter on suffering and saying, let's talk about suffering, because a lot of parents don't know what to do with suffering, which is why their kids don't know, you know? And then after that, it's just a kind of a series of frameworks. These are not the answers to everybody's questions. I'm not doing hard intellectual apologetics here of here's 3 arguments for hell or whatever. What I'm just trying to do is reframe some things of here's how you thought about doctrine before. Have you thought about it this way? And maybe that would help in some of your conversations. You've thought about the Christian life this way. Have you thought about it like this? And maybe this would help in some of these conversations. You've organized your church, pastor, like this. Is that really conducive for somebody's faith? Or could we reorganize it too? And actually simplify it in order to be more conducive to somebody's faith, and on like that. And so I'm trying to help people walk with people through deconstruction. That's why the subtitle is How to Be a Companion in a Crisis of Faith. Right. Because I think that's what people need more than anything. But beyond the Spirit of God acting in their life, the layer down from that is they just need people who care for them, who will walk with them, who will take the long view. This process for me was over 10 years. I've talked to lots of other people. Some people say it was 12 years. Some people say 7 years. I think we have to extend our time horizon a lot.
A lot more patience with people. A lot
more patience with people. Because we want people to, we get anxious. Right. We get anxious. Are they saved? Are they not saved? Are they going to stay? Are they going to leave? Well, I don't know. So we get anxious. So we try to control it instead of just releasing the work of their faith to God. Right. And let the Spirit do what only the Spirit can do. And us just sort of be there for them and have the conversations and absorb their anxieties and give those over to God over however long it takes, and just not be scared. I think people get scared when people start believing things that we would call heresy. And again, I understand why. Heresy's bad. I feel like I have to say this every time I say this point, like heresy, bad. I'm not for it. You know what I mean? But if someone is questioning some of these things that are core to our faith, who is Jesus, the Bible, God, these really, really core things, we get anxious because we thought, well, what if they come to a different conclusion than me? And what I hope it can be reframed as, actually, that's something we should all be doing. We should all be trying to understand the most fundamental things of our faith. I
found some comfort in wording, and this is maybe not the best way to word it for someone deconstructing at the beginning, but I have found comfort in thinking about faith as trust in God's certain promises. So not that we need to be certain or that we won't doubt or whatever, but the fact that God's promises are certain for us in Christ, and that he gives us those in faith, is kind of this hammock where, someone might be trying to wrestle their way out intentionally or unintentionally, but we can trust like God's got that person and he has us and he's big enough to handle, he's big enough for our questions. It's somewhat of a cliche, but it's true. Like he's so much bigger than the doubts that you bring to him. And I really like the way you talked about doubt. I think this was in the first part of the book, because I think I've seen a lot of that where doubt is either, and probably this is like an example of also the way people just talk about deconstruction in general, but doubt is either seen as almost like a virtue by people who are in deconstruction circles. Like you need to doubt, do it. Or it's so taboo you can't even talk about it in more probably fundamentalist or conservative circles. Can you talk a little bit about how you approached it?
Yeah, so I definitely have come to think about doubt a lot differently than what I used to think about it. Again, I think I originally just thought about it in kind of these like intellectual questions or whatever, but what I've realized is a lot of things that we think are intellectual are less intellectual than we think they are, and they're more imaginative. So let me explain what I mean by that. So there's he's kind of gaining popularity right now, but there's this family systems theorist named Edwin Friedman, who he is no longer with us, but he kind of pioneered family systems theory, which is, I mean, if you go to counseling for any family related stuff, you're going to run into this, it's pretty standard now. But what he coined this term called imaginative gridlock. And he sort of said that there are three interlocking causes and symptoms of imaginative gridlock. And so what imaginative gridlock is this idea that you cannot imagine anything outside of your current reality. You are stuck in whatever is in front of you, and it's almost like you have existential horse blinders on. You can't see anything beyond it. And so what that does, for a while you don't notice it, but if anything starts to puncture that reality, that creates a lot of anxiety. And he says anxiety is just reactivity. It's like your functions shut down and you just start reacting to everything, And so the three interlocking causes and symptoms of imaginative gridlock are the feeling of being on a never-ending treadmill of trying harder, being forced into false either-or dichotomies, and searching for certainty instead of reframing the question. And when I read that, I thought, oh, I've been in that church before.
Yeah.
Of a never-ending treadmill of trying harder.
Yeah.
False dichotomies, and being searching for certainty instead of reframing the question. And I was like, I was imaginatively gridlocked. And I was thinking about it, and you were asked about passages in Scripture, and I was reading through Exodus for a Bible study at our church, and we're getting to the crossing of the Red Sea. And I realized that, they had just crossed through the Red Sea, or this story, So they get to the Red Sea, and they see Pharaoh chasing them. And they were like, what did you do? You just brought us out here to die? I just like, what are you doing? They're going to kill us. Yeah. They couldn't. And then they cross over, and they just crossed over the Red Sea. They just watched Pharaoh die. It's the exact same response. I mean, they have their, big moment in Exodus 15. They're like praising God. And then it's like immediately like, oh, it would have been so much better to be back in Egypt. I'd rather be eating, scraps in Egypt than dying out here in the wilderness. And it paints this perfect, and I break it down in the book, but it paints this perfect picture of imaginative gridlock. Yeah. Of they were in slavery for 400 years. And the second they're free, it creates this, instead of feeling free, that actually creates anxiety in Israel, And so doubt, I think, functions in a lot of the exact same ways. Doubt is when that gridlock is starting to be punctured and that anxiety is coming up in us, because all we've ever known is a treadmill of trying harder. And so that's all we think we should do is try.
Right.
Very little surrender to grace, you know? We are still thinking in terms of either or false dichotomies, right? Of like, well, if it's, and you see this in deconstruction, well, if it's not this, then it has to be that, you know what I mean? And that's why the pendulum swings from like hyper-conservatism to hyper-progressivism, you know, because of these false dichotomies. And then seeking certainty instead of reframing the question. Again, even in deconstruction and progressive circles, when doubt, mystery is talked a lot about, there's still, if you look closely enough, a high level amount of certainty, even sometimes in their uncertainty.
Yes.
And there's not this reframing of the question just in terms of like, what is the Bible actually trying to say here? And again, going back to the false stories and everything, maybe I'm reading this through the lens of a story that the Bible's not telling. And I need to put that story to the side and try to get into what the story of the Bible actually is, reframe the question, and see if something else comes out on the other side, you know?
Yeah.
And so just starting to see doubt that way of, it's not this simple intellectual process of going through questions or I'm just doubting, but it actually is an imaginative, and your imagination is ultimately an emotional process, you know? And so the intellectual things are downstream of our imagination, downstream of our emotions, downstream of our anxieties, which means doubt is ultimately an expression of anxiety. Yeah. And so what this is why I think people got wrong. This is why I write the book. It's like when you're walking with someone through deconstruction and you're just talking about the doubts and just talking about the intellectual questions, those matter. Right. We should talk about this, but we're not addressing the underlying anxieties. We're not double clicking enough to say, when did you start questioning the Bible? Oh, it was when your parents got divorced and your dad did this. And, you know, it was through this season of loss or difficulty in your life. And these were the expectations that you had. And I totally get why you had those expectations. Can we reframe that question? And like, what if you had these expectations instead? Yeah. What would that do to this event in your life? That changes the doubt, because now you're doubting the doubts. You're going to the questions under the questions that Newbigin was talking about. And you're saying, we can question these, and I'm not saying let's not talk about them, but can we talk about the thing under the thing? Right. Because these questions are coming out of anxieties, not just like, I woke up today and I had a really interesting question on my mind. You know? Yeah. And so, I mean, I think that's so good and so helpful to all, because we want to think that we're intellectual beings first, and we're rational beings first, and we're not. We're emotional. And Jonathan Haidt, I don't know if you've read him, but talks so much about that in The Righteous Mind, and in a lot of his work. And I think it's so helpful to reframe that way. And what a big help to think of, like, the intellectual coming out of these experiences, and typically experiences of suffering for people. Like that, I think, is so true. That's where it starts. I'm curious, we're, wrapping up, but I'm curious kind of your thoughts, this period of deconstruction, Christian deconstruction, seems to be somewhat of like our zeitgeist, like just part of what's been happening in our culture. Where do you see it headed? I mean, on one hand, I think deconstruction is a very personal process, right? And so I don't think, the church has not always used the word deconstruction, but I think the church has always had categories for deconstruction. Yeah. So like the dark night of the soul, or different things like that. I mean, reading Confessions from Augustine, I was like, oh, this dude definitely deconstructed. You know what I mean? It's like, it's never in the book, but it's like, he describes his journey, and I'm like, that's exactly it, And it was after he started deconstructing, quote unquote, when he was 17, after his dad, who he did not have a good relationship with, died. And it's like, well, yeah, that makes sense. It runs to the Manichees, and then different things like that. It takes him about 10 years. Yeah. So I think in terms of that, I don't think deconstruction is going to go anywhere, because I think it's a natural part of the life of faith for some people, and that's part of the reason I wanted to write the book, is I wanted to give a category for that, of tying deconstruction to some of these other things, and saying this is just part of it for some people, So I think in that regard, it's not going anywhere. Right. Now, there are cultural elements that I think light the match of deconstruction for some people, because if deconstruction is a crisis, something has to cause the crisis. I think in the going back to Augustine and myself, that was in large part catalyzed by suffering, by loss. I think that's actually, I don't know how to say this in a way that doesn't sound callous, but I think that's maybe the best way for deconstruction to start, is this like, I experienced this loss that broke all my categories, and now I don't know what to do. I need to find God, and I don't know where he went. Experiencing that absence of God. But there are other categories that catalyze deconstruction. So you have like cultural Christianity, which again was what we talked about earlier, just being around a church of Christians who like, does anybody actually believe this stuff? Because this and this and this is happening, and whatever. And so you don't have these, and you have these churches that compromise too by going from formative institutions, formative communities that are meant to shape people into the image of Christ, to performative communities where leadership and everybody else, the church exists for them to perform for each other in one way or another. Sometimes that's a literal performance, which is, we can talk about that. But other times it's just like these performative identities for each other, to gain status. And that's, again, contributes to the, does anybody believe this feeling of it all? So I think there's that. There's other cultural forces going on politically and things like that. But, if you spend much time on the internet, I do you'll see people talking about some people are saying is going on right now, this vibe shift that is happening. It's not all good. There are things that I would critique about it, but I also think part of this quote unquote vibe shift is some of the postmodern relativistic, assumptions, these stories that I was talking about, these assumptions that have not been questioned are being questioned on a cultural level in real time right now. And so there is some of this, I mean, again, I'm not saying this guy's like the beacon of whatever, but yesterday, a biblical historian, Wesley Huff, was on the Joe Rogan podcast for 3.5 hours. Yeah. And I watched it. Yeah. And I'm like, if Joe doesn't get saved after this, a couple million of his listeners are going to. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I saw some clips and it was amazing.
And that's not the end all be all. That's one indicator. You know what I'm saying? And but something is definitely happening. Some people will call it like a metamodernism, where modernism was also about these like black and white, good and bad heroes. Right. Postmodernism emptied that and questioned all of that to get these really gray kind of anti-heroes, the Paul Atreides type figures from Dune, it was a great movie, by the way, not knocking Dune. I loved it. But, but then you have this metamodernism, which sort of looks at both of them and sees the postmodern critique of modernism and says, you're right. Kind of that Ecclesiastes, like it is more complicated than that. But
what are we rebuilding to?
If you just empty everything,
there's
no meaning to life. There's no purpose to life. Like, what are we doing here? Yeah, And so this metamodern mood kind of takes both of them, and the word that is used for it is oscillating. It oscillates between irony and sincerity, between something solid and something more ambiguous. And so this oscillating between the two is trying to integrate these two worldviews. I don't know if that's possible or not, but it is a vibe shift. And it is not this deconstructive, postmodern, empty everything of meaning. It is saying, can we find something sturdy here
to stand on?
Yeah. And so you have this sort of resurgence of cultural Christianity, not in the sense of we're all just sort of performing for each other, but cultural Christianity is sort of the Tom Holland historian way of, which, we owe a lot to Christianity, and maybe we shouldn't just throw this all out. Maybe we should examine it. And there's a version of that just kind of wants to steal the fruit of Christianity without actually getting to Christ itself. That's not good. But how many people are going to embark on that project and get to Christ himself? I'm hopeful about that.
I'm hopeful about that, but I am interested to see how it goes, because I think, what there's, the saying, what you win them with, you win them to. Like,
sure.
Are we winning them to a good morality?
For sure.
That is Christless. That concerns me, but I'm hopeful too. I think hopeful that, Christ is that foundation that we're standing on. And the things I hear you saying is that there's the shift going on is maybe it's even hard to tell like if it's good or bad at this point,
Totally.
but like people are shifting their, like well-known people are shifting their
Yes.
priorities and values, and that's signaling something is happening. We could go on and on for hours, I think, but this has been great. And I want to let you go and respect your time. Tell us where and when we can get the book, and anything else you're working on, or where we can find your other work.
Yeah, recording before, but the book
Yeah.
is out, so you can go on Amazon and get it right now. Please do. If you think it would be helpful for you. And if not, then don't get it. That's fine. But yeah, so the book is out. You can get it wherever you get books. I'm on social media for better or for worse. So I'm on X, Ian Harber. I'm on Instagram, Ian Harber. My Instagram is pretty much just dedicated to books, you know. And then probably the best place would be Substack. So I'm on Substack. I have a newsletter. It's called, you can go to backagainwords.com. And you can subscribe to the newsletter. I try to write once a week. Sometimes it's every other week, but I try to just keep writing there. There's also the Substack notes. That's kind of like Twitter, but better there, which is good. But yeah, and I'm just working on that.
It's great.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so thankful. I really have enjoyed just reading what you write and the perspective that you bring to this conversation that I think is really important, and that is for worse, better or worse, you know, very black and white in a lot of people's minds. And I think when we're dealing with people and emotions, it's good to come at issues like deconstruction with some compassion and understanding and patience, as we talked about. So thankful for what you've written and excited for people to read. Thanks for your time, Ian.
It's really kind. Thank you.
Yeah. Outside Ourselves is a 1517 podcast and show. To learn more about all of our podcasts and all of our shows, please go to 1517.org/podcast. If you are listening and watching on YouTube, I hope you will subscribe to the Outside Yourselves channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming content. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast app and you haven't done so already, I would really love if you could give the show a 5-star rating. It takes about 1 second to do that. A written review is also always really nice if you have time for that. I'm so excited and looking forward to what's in store for this year. Stay tuned. We have some exciting interviews and content planned for this upcoming year. I'm thankful and grateful that I get to do this and feel like I get to learn something new with every interview and every episode. I hope that's the case for you as well. See you next time.